Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive.
Yes, welcome back.
This time we're going to be looking at something that you probably do every single day, maybe even without thinking about it.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Decisions.
Yeah, big ones, little ones everywhere.
What is there like a science to this?
Well, there is. There's a whole field of study called decision theory.
Oh, right.
And it's trying to understand how we make those choices and if we're doing it in a way that, well, makes sense, rationally speaking.
To help us figure this out, we have some excerpts from Decision Theory, a brief introduction.
That's a good one.
And it looks at kind of both sides of the coin.
Yeah, how we should make decisions and then also how we actually do.
How we actually do it in the real world.
The messy real world.
So we're going to unpack how we make decisions. What are some of those common pitfalls that we all fall into, and why sometimes what we think is the best choice might not actually be the best choice.
You might be surprised how often that happens.
And how often our intuition kind of leads us astray.
Yeah, that gut feeling is not always the best guide.
The text starts off with a really interesting quote, and it says, "Almost everything that a human being does involves decisions."
Right, so true.
It's kind of crazy to think about how many decisions we make every single day.
From the small, like, what am I going to have for breakfast, to,
To the huge ones.
the life-changing ones.
But this text is saying that decision theory really focuses on those moments where we have our freedom to choose a path.
Those pivotal moments where we're setting a course based on a goal.
And you know what that goal is.
Exactly.
So are there like steps to this? Are there like rules that we can follow?
Well, the text explores some models
Okay.
for how these decisions unfold.
Like what?
Like Condorcet's three-stage model, where you
Oh.
first discuss principles,
Right.
you narrow down your options, and then you finally make a choice.
So that's one model. What's another one?
There's also the sequential model from Dewey and Simon.
Hmm.
That one is more about gathering information,
Okay.
designing solutions, and then making the choice.
Got it.
And then you've got Mintzberg, who kind of throws a wrench in things.
Okay.
Well, his dynamic model suggests that all these phases that we've talked about, they happen in loops,
Oh.
not like a straight line.
So it's not as simple as step 1, step 2, step 3.
Nope, real-life decisions are way messier than that.
The text makes a really good point that often we're gathering information, considering alternatives,
And evaluating
and evaluating them.
all at the same time.
Yeah.
It's not a neat process.
Think about a recent decision you made.
I bet it didn't really follow a step-by-step.
Definitely not.
So what are those core elements then?
Yeah, what are the important things?
Well, the text goes into preferences and utilities.
Oh, yeah, our values.
Exactly.
So how do we express that?
Well, one way is just to simply say, I prefer A to B.
Right.
Or you could assign values to things like a rating system.
Yeah.
The text does this funny thing with philosophers.
What do they do?
Well, they give Bertrand Russell a 50, but poor Heidegger only gets a 1.
Well, what a burn.
Right.
But I mean, it is kind of subjective.
It is, and it brings up an interesting question. Can we always compare any two things?
Yeah, what if we just don't know enough about them?
Exactly. Imagine trying to compare like two pieces of music
Yeah,
that you've only heard once and they're incredibly complex.
that's impossible.
So that's the idea of completeness.
Oh, yeah.
This assumption that we can rank everything even with limited information.
We can't always do that, can we?
Nope.
And then there's transitivity.
So
So remind me what that is again.
if A is better than B and B is better than C,
Then A has to be better than C, right?
well, that's what we would think.
Yeah.
But the text gives this mind-boggling example with Mozart, Haydn, and Beethoven.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
And based on one person's preferences, you can actually conclude that Beethoven is both better and worse than Mozart.
Hold on, how is that even possible?
It's a paradox.
That breaks logic.
It shows that even simple principles like transitivity can break down when you're dealing with real-world preferences.
So how do decision theorists map all of this out?
Well, they use this handy tool called a decision matrix.
A decision matrix.
Yeah, imagine like a table
Okay.
where your choices are the rows,
Mhm.
and then the columns are all the factors outside of your control.
Things you can't control.
Exactly. It's like the states of nature.
Okay.
And then each cell in that table shows the potential outcome
Of what?
of each combination of choice and state of nature.
Okay, so it's a way to visualize all of the possibility.
It is. It helps, especially when you're dealing with uncertainty.
Can you give me an example?
Sure, let's use the classic umbrella scenario.
Okay,
So you have to decide whether to bring your umbrella.
right. Bring it or don't bring it.
And the state of nature is whether it rains or not.
Okay.
So your choices, those are your rows, bring the umbrella or don't.
Right.
And the when are possibilities, those are your columns, rain or no rain.
Okay, got it.
And then each cell describes how your day goes based on that combination.
Like happy and dry or wet but prepared.
Exactly.
I like that, wet but prepared.
It's all about planning.
But it does get more complicated when you factor in certainty and uncertainty.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Because sometimes you just know what's going to happen.
That's certainty, but it's rare.
Yeah, most of the time it's more like flipping a coin.
That's risk when you know the probabilities of the outcomes.
But life isn't always as predictable as a coin flip.
No, it's not.
So most of the time we're dealing with uncertainty.
Right, where you have some idea of the probabilities.
But it's not precise.
And then there's ignorance.
Ignorant.
Where you have no clue about the probabilities at all.
So you're making a decision with absolutely no idea what might happen.
That's where the tough calls are made.
That sounds stressful.
It can be.
So before we get into those really tricky situations, let's talk about how decision theorists try to bring order to this chaos.
How do they make sense of risk?
Yeah.
Well, there's this concept called expected utility.
Ooh, expected utility. That sounds interesting.
It is. We'll have to dive into that.
Next time.
Yeah, stay tuned for that.
We'll be right back. So we were just about to unpack this idea of expected utility.
Right, EU for short.
A way to make sense of decisions when there's that element of risk.
Yeah, it's been like the dominant theory for these kinds of decisions, but it's not without its critics.
So before we get to the critics, can you give me like a really simple explanation of what expected utility actually is?
Okay, so basically you're weighing the potential benefits of each choice against how likely those benefits are to actually happen.
Okay.
So you calculate the expected usefulness
Okay.
of each outcome.
Got it.
And then you just pick the option with the highest total score.
So kind of like picking the option that gives you the most bang for your buck.
Exactly. But as you might imagine, it's not always that
I
straightforward.
was going to say there has to be more to it.
There are definitely some situations where EU kind of falls short.
Like what?
Well, for instance, when you're dealing with really rare events,
Okay.
those potentially catastrophic ones. Yeah.
Simply averaging out the risks can be misleading.
Can you give me an example?
Okay, imagine you've got two scenarios.
Okay.
One has a tiny, tiny chance of something happening.
Okay.
But if it does happen, it could cause like 50 deaths.
Okay.
The other scenario has a slightly higher chance of something happening, but it would only cause one death.
Okay. So in the first scenario, the risk is super low, but the potential outcome is much worse.
Right, and if you just went by EU, you might choose the second option because the expected number of deaths overall is lower.
But that doesn't feel right. It feels like you're ignoring the fact that 50 lives are at stake, even if the risk is tiny.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It shows how EU sometimes struggles to account for those really high-impact, low-probability events.
The text also mentions some problems with how EU handles comparisons between risks.
Oh, yeah, you mean like that classic safer than driving a car argument?
Oh, yeah, I've heard that one.
It's often used to downplay a new risk by comparing it to something we already accept.
As if they're directly related. Exactly. It's like saying, well, you already take the risk of eating peanuts, so why worry about this experimental new drug?
Right, that's not a fair comparison.
Nope. Just because we accept certain risks doesn't mean we should automatically accept any new risk, just because statistically it's smaller.
So are there other approaches that can help us make better decisions?
Well, there's Bayesianism.
Bayesianism, that name always makes my head spin a little.
Yeah, it can be a bit intimidating at first, but it's really about updating our beliefs based on new evidence.
Okay, so it's like a constant learning process.
Yeah, exactly. We all have beliefs about the world.
Right.
And Bayesianism says those beliefs should be coherent, meaning they don't contradict each other.
Okay, that makes sense.
We also assign probabilities to different events based on what we know.
Even if it's just, I don't know enough yet.
Right. But the key here is that we constantly update those beliefs as we get new information.
So we're always refining our understanding.
Exactly. To do that, we use something called Bayes' theorem.
Bayes' theorem, I'm not going to ask you to explain the math.
Don't worry about the math. Just know that it's a way to calculate how new evidence should shift our understanding of probabilities.
Okay, so how does this tie back into decision-making?
Like, EU Bayesianism aims to guide us toward the choice that maximizes our expected benefit.
Okay.
But it acknowledges that our knowledge is always changing.
So it's still about weighing outcomes and probabilities.
Yeah, but it's more dynamic.
It seems more aligned with how our brains actually work.
Right, and the text actually explores some interesting challenges to Bayesianism,
I'm listening.
where our intuitive choices seem to go against logic.
Love a good paradox.
Well, one famous one is a Lay's paradox.
A Lay's paradox. What is that?
It presents you with two sets of choices involving gambles.
Okay.
And people's preferences often contradict what Bayesianism would predict.
Really?
Yeah, the text actually includes the decision matrices so you can try it out yourself.
Ooh, I like a challenge.
And then there's Ellsberg's paradox.
Okay, what's that one about?
This one shows that people really don't like ambiguity.
Ambiguity.
Yeah, when you don't have all the information.
So when you're making a decision with incomplete information.
Exactly. The classic example involves red balls and an unknown mix of black and yellow balls.
Okay, I'm following.
People tend to prefer betting on the red balls where they know the odds.
Even if the unknown mix could give them a better chance of winning.
It seems we're kind of scared of the unknown.
Even if it might help us.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it?
So are these just errors in human reasoning?
That's the big question. Or do we need decision theories that actually reflect how we really think?
So maybe the problem isn't us. Maybe it's the theories.
That's a good point, and it leads to an even more complex question. What happens when we don't even know what we don't know?
Okay, that sounds like a real head-scratcher.
It is. It's the realm of unknown possibilities.
Unknown possibility.
Where we're making choices that could have consequences we haven't even considered.
I can't even wrap my head around that.
Well, think about the first atomic bomb.
Okay.
They calculated a lot of risks, but could they have accounted for every possible outcome?
Like what if it had ignited the atmosphere?
Exactly. Thankfully, it didn't.
Yeah.
But it shows how hard it is to make decisions when you can't fully grasp the consequences.
Are there any other examples?
Here's the case of polywater.
Polywater. What's that?
Scientists thought it might replace all the water on Earth.
Wow.
Turned out to be false, but it highlights how limited knowledge can lead to unexpected outcomes.
So how do you even approach decisions with these unknown possibilities?
Well, the text suggests considering a few things.
Like what?
Whether one option is clearly more prone to the unknown than others.
Okay.
Whether we're dealing with something totally new. Whether the effects could be contained or spread widely.
Yeah.
And whether we're messing with complex systems that are in a delicate balance.
So like ecosystems.
Those
Those are all good things to think about.
Especially for decisions with big consequences.
What about when the problem itself is unclear?
That's the challenge of indeterminate decision horizons.
Indeterminate decision horizons.
It's about defining the scope of the problem we're trying to solve.
I feel like that's something I struggle with a lot.
It's common the text uses nuclear waste disposal as an example.
Uh-huh.
Is it just about finding a safe place to store it?
Right.
Or is it part of a bigger conversation about energy and sustainability?
Different people might see the problem in totally different ways.
Exactly, and that can lead to different solutions.
So we've gone from basic choices to mind-boggling paradoxes to the very definition of the problem.
Decision theory is a wild ride.
It is, and we haven't even talked about social decision theory.
We'll have to save that for another deep dive.
A whole other layer of complexity.
But for now, we've given you plenty to think about.
We have. What are some of the key takeaways that stand out to you?
Well, I think the biggest one is...
Welcome back, everyone.
Yes, welcome back.
We've been on quite a journey exploring decision theory.
It's a fascinating field, isn't it?
It is, and if I'm being honest, I'm starting to feel like my brain needs a break.
I hear you. It's a lot to process.
Well, so far we've been focusing on decisions made by individuals.
Right, like you and me.
But what about those decisions that are made by groups?
Yes, like whole societies.
Yeah, where the stakes are even higher.
That's where social decision theory comes in.
Social decision theory.
And trust me, it gets even more complicated.
Things were already getting pretty complicated with just me and my umbrella.
Right. Well, imagine trying to account for the preferences and biases of an entire group of people.
Oh my God.
That's a whole other level of complexity.
So how do we even begin to think about decision-making at that scale?
One approach is to think of the group as a single rational individual.
As if everyone just agrees on everything.
Yeah, it's a simplification that's often used in legal theory or when analyzing corporations.
But in the real world, people don't always agree.
Right, and that's where collective decision theory comes in.
Collective decision theory.
It recognizes that groups are made up of individuals.
With their own goals and values.
Exactly, and the text we've been looking at highlights one particular challenge.
What's that?
How to combine those individual preferences into a collective choice.
Is there a way to do that that's fair and rational?
That's the million-dollar question, because if we can't, it seems like we're doomed to endless debates and gridlock.
Well, the text introduces us to some work by Borda and Condorcet.
Oh, yeah. They had this brilliant insight.
What was it?
Even with something as simple as majority rule, you can end up with unstable outcomes.
Unstable? What do you mean?
Like, no matter what you choose, there's always another majority that would prefer something different.
So you're saying even if a decision wins a vote,
Yeah.
it might not actually be stable?
Exactly. They use an example of deciding what to do with nuclear waste.
Okay, let's hear it.
Imagine you've got economists who want to postpone the decision,
Yeah, hey.
ethicists who prefer a really expensive but safe solution,
Okay.
and industry folks who are pushing for their own proposal.
So 3 different groups with 3 different preferences.
And no matter which option gets a majority vote, you can always find another majority that would overturn it.
So it's like a decision-making merry-go-round that never stops,
It highlights the potential for chaos in group decision-making.
even when everyone has reasonable preferences.
Right, so if majority rule isn't the answer, is there any other system that can guarantee a stable outcome?
Well, that's what Kenneth Arrow tried to figure out.
Oh yes, Arrow's impossibility theorem.
What did he find?
Basically, he said no, not if you want your decision rule to be fair and rational.
So are we just stuck then?
It's not that we're stuck, but it does mean we need to be aware of these limitations.
And be thoughtful about the processes we use to make decisions as a group.
Absolutely, because there are rarely easy answers.
That's a good takeaway from any deep dive.
It is a healthy dose of skepticism is always good.
We've covered so much ground today, from individual choices to the mind-boggling world of social decision theory.
We've gone from umbrellas to nuclear waste.
It's been quite a ride, but before we go, I want to leave our listeners with something to think about.
Okay, what's that?
We've been talking about how to make decisions well. But what about those times when we intentionally make bad decisions?
That's an interesting question.
Like when we choose to do something, even though we know it's not the best choice?
Sometimes the act of choosing itself can be satisfying.
Like indulging in a treat, even though you know it's not healthy.
Exactly, or making a decision based on love or loyalty, even if it goes against logic.
It seems like there's more to decision-making than just rationality.
There's a human element that can't be ignored.
So maybe sometimes those irrational choices are actually the more fulfilling ones.
Or even the more ethical ones.
That's definitely something to ponder.
It is food for thought.
We've given you a lot to chew on today.
We have a lot of ideas to digest.
So tell us what surprised you the most in this deep dive into decision theory.
And where do you see these ideas playing out in your own life?
Head over to our social media and share your thoughts. We'd love to hear from you.
Join the conversation.
Thanks for listening, everyone.
Until next time.